Ladies and gentlemen, if I may interrupt your conversations, we're going to resume the program. I would like at this time to invite Daisy Soros, who is a board member of both the Metropolitan Opera and the Foreign Policy Association, to present the Foreign Policy Association medal to Peter Gelb.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Daisy Soros, and I am delighted to introduce Peter Gelb from the Metropolitan Opera and to present him with the PFA medal. I am much better in telling jokes than introducing people. However, they told me not to do that tonight. Since 2006, Peter has transformed the opera scene, bringing new life and relevance to the opera scene. And tonight, we honor him, recognizing his innovative contribution to opera and cultural diplomacy. I've had the pleasure of knowing Peter personally for a number of years, and his passion for opera is totally admirable. From his early days as a teenager, he was an usher at the Met. He has always been dedicated to making opera more acceptable to a wider audience. One of his most groundbreaking and successful project is the Met Live in HD, a series of live performance transmission exhibited in high definition in movie theaters. Since its launch in December 2006, this Peabody and Emmy Award-winning series has sold over 29 million tickets and can now be enjoyed on more than 2,200 screens in over 70 countries across the 6 continents. All I can say is wow. And I don't say that right. In addition, the Met also hosts free public dress rehearsals, which often includes children from local schools, and also broadcast the opening night performance on an enormous screen in Times Square. Which creates even more opportunities for opera enthusiasts. Peter's tireless effort have truly transformed the opera world, making it more inclusive and accessible to people from all walks of life. Furthermore, this incredibly popular rush ticket program provides discounted seats in prime location for both weekday and weekend performances. There is a lot more I could say, but as of now, it is my sincere pleasure and honor to present Mr. Peter Gelb, manager of the Metropolitan Opera, with the PFA medal. This also comes with my personal very best wishes, because I think, Peter, you know that I am a great fan of yours. Oh my goodness, that's gorgeous. Okay, may I put it on your neck?
Lord, it'll break my neck. Thank you very much.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much, Daisy. I'm proud to receive this award. Daisy, the Met is very lucky to count you among its most ardent supporters, and I'm lucky to have known you for the past 18 years as I've attempted to run the world's busiest opera house, otherwise known as an asylum for wayward tenors and other vocal types. While it is true that I spend a lot of my time trying to help vanquish the inner demons of singers. It was my predecessor who once told a recalcitrant soprano that her wig was going on with or without her. I have also devoted my career at the Met and before to cultural diplomacy, doing my best to play a role in elevating humanity through art and artistic exchange. In the 1970s, as the assistant manager of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, I organized the orchestra's trip to China to help normalize relations following the signing of the historic agreement between Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter. In the 80s, as the manager of legendary pianist Vladimir Horowitz, I produced his return to Russia as the first event under the cultural exchange agreement between Gorbachev and Reagan that helped open the door to nuclear détente. In the early 90s, during Perestroika, as a documentary filmmaker, I made a film about cellist Mstislav Rostropovich's heroic return to Russia after his 10 years in exile. Later in the 90s, as president of Sony Classical, the record label, I commissioned and produced Tan Dun's Symphony 1997, featuring Yo-Yo Ma and ancient Chinese bells that became the official music of the Hong Kong handover. During my years running the Met, we brought cultural solace to the world before, during, and after the pandemic with our groundbreaking initiative to transmit our operas via satellite live to audiences from the southern hemisphere to inside the Arctic Circle. Most recently, the Met has devoted itself to supporting Ukraine in its fight for liberty with the creation of the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra, which this summer will be embarking on its third international tour, the Beethoven Ninth Freedom Tour. I'm proud that the founder and conductor of the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra, who is rarely in New York as she pursues her far-flung career around the globe and who, in my opinion, is the personification of cultural diplomacy, is here tonight. Please welcome Canadian-Ukrainian conductor Carrie Lynn Wilson. One disclaimer, Carrie Lynn also happens to be my wife. Long before coming to the Met and throughout my career, I pursued politically charged cultural events, whether in China or Russia, no matter how tense. When I was in my 20s, I was the assistant manager of the Boston Symphony Orchestra and was responsible for initiating and organizing its historic tour to China in 1978. Jointly announced by Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter on the stage of the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., the Boston Symphony Tour of China marked the end of the Cultural Revolution, following the imprisonment of the infamous Gang of Four. Entering China at the end of the Cultural Revolution felt as strange as visiting another planet. With the support of Pan Am, we remember Pan Am, we arrived on the first 747 ever to land in China. Accompanying the orchestra were most major American news organizations who were setting foot in China for the first time in years. Technologically backward, a stairway tall enough to reach the plane's forward door had to be shipped from Hong Kong. Almost entirely cut off from the West for a decade, Beijing in 1978 had no skyscrapers, just a few Stalin-built, Soviet-style edifices. The Chinese were dressed uniformly in Mao suits and rode bicycles. There were almost no cars, just a few ancient Soviet limousines. And not surprisingly, there was no room for dissent. When I complained about the cockroaches in my hotel room, my Chinese minder informed me that there were no cockroaches in China, and that I must have brought them with me. Everywhere we went, we would be followed by crowds who were as curious about us as we were about them. We would take Polaroids and provide our subjects with instant images to their wonderment and amazement. Backstage at the concert hall, we had an audience with Deng Xiaoping himself. The only person not wearing a Mao suit was his alluring young female attendant who dressed in red silk and lit his cigarettes. While we were busy with our concerts, Chinese engineers were were busy secretly studying the 747's engines. They had a lot of lost time to make up for. 8 years later, in 1986, I was the 33-year-old manager of Vladimir Horowitz, arguably the greatest pianist in history, and perhaps its most neurotic. I brought him to Moscow in official recognition of the pending détente negotiated by Gorbachev and Reagan. In fact, he was the first event in the cultural exchange agreement signed by the two leaders. Horowitz's concert was presented live and in its entirety as a news special on CBS in the United States and on the BBC and other broadcasters across the world. Getting Horowitz to agree to return to his motherland was extremely challenging, since his many phobias had to be addressed to his satisfaction. Obsessed with his diet, Horowitz insisted on eating the exact same menu for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for years on end. At the time, his nightly meals included fresh Dover sole and asparagus, two items decidedly not available in Cold War Moscow. Unfazed by this culinary challenge, Secretary of State George Shultz and the American ambassador to Russia, Arthur Hartman, enlisted the aid of our allies. The Italian ambassador promised to secure the asparagus, and the British ambassador arranged for the fresh sole to be air couriers from London. Thus, the first Dover sole airlift to Moscow was born. 1 month before the Horowitzes were supposed to arrive, with an entourage that included his chef, piano tuner, his customized trigger action Steinway, and me, disaster struck. The pianist Vladimir Felsman, one of the Jewish refuseniks who were endlessly waiting for their exit papers, was about to begin a recital in the salon of Spaso House when it was discovered that the strings of his piano had been cut. In the audience was the New York Times bureau chief, who filed a front-page article about what clearly had been an act of KGB sabotage. Horowitz read the article and immediately threatened to cancel. It was only when Reagan himself had a letter hand-delivered on White House stationery to Horowitz guaranteeing his safety and the safety of his piano that the tour was back on. In fact, Horowitz's piano traveled to Moscow guarded by U.S. Marines. Managing with Horowitz was challenging but also thrilling, and he was always ready to offer me his own homespun advice. Regarding acoustics, he once told me, "If the check is good, the acoustics are good." In 1991, I co-directed a documentary film about Mstislav Rostropovich and his wife, Galina Vishnevskaya. It was a portrait of their heroism in the face of Soviet persecution. 10 years earlier, they had stood up to Brezhnev, sheltering Alexander Solzhenitsyn in their dacha outside of Moscow, even though it meant sacrificing their careers as Russia's leading cellist and soprano. Facing global criticism for his mistreatment of them, Brezhnev chose to exile them rather than sending them all to the Gulag. Our film was about their triumphant return during Perestroika, a time when it looked like the world might be coming together. But of course, Putin has completely reversed that trajectory. In 1997, when I was running the Sony classical record label, we joined the Hong Kong government in commissioning Tan Dun, the composer, to write the official music of the handover, Symphony 1997, featuring Yo-Yo Ma and the ancient Chinese bells that had recently been unearthed. At the time, the world was hopeful that China would keep its word. With the launch of Putin's ruthless attack on Ukraine on February 24th, the possibility for cultural exchange with the government of Russia ended for the Met, at least so long as Putin was in power. No longer a Cold War, but a real one. From the beginning of the invasion, the Met has taken action to support Ukraine. First, by immediately cutting its ties with Putin-supported artistic institutions and his artist cronies. Within several days of the invasion, we performed the Ukrainian national anthem at the Metropolitan Opera to start the second half of our season, and a few weeks later, we performed a special concert for Ukraine featuring some of opera's most beloved stars that was broadcast live on Ukrainian public radio. While the Met was acting with decisiveness against the Putin regime, we never stopped honoring great Russian art or the innocent Russian artists who are hostages to Putin's war. On the very day that Putin was denouncing the West for allegedly canceling Russian art, we opened a run of Tchaikovsky's Eugene Onegin with a cast of Russian singers. As I said at the time, our goal was to cancel Putin, not Pushkin. Immediately following the invasion, Carrie Lynn, my wife, was scheduled to be guest conducting in Odessa, but with her concerts postponed because of the war, she joined me in London, where we watched in horror as the brutal invasion and bombardment continued to unfold. Seeing the endless river of refugees forced to flee their homelands, Carrie Lynn was stirred to raise her baton in defense of her ancestral homeland. It was her inspiration to form the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra, and it was my duty to see it through. We wanted to demonstrate the power of music in the time of war and to raise the morale of the Ukrainian artistic community and its embattled citizens. We wanted to show Putin that Ukrainian culture thrives in spite of his efforts to destroy it. I am proud to have helped her dream become reality. Together with the Polish National Opera and in partnership with the governments of Ukraine and Poland, the Met has provided the infrastructure to support the creation of the orchestra, whose members hail from cities across Ukraine, as well as recently arrived refugees and members of the Ukrainian musical diaspora of Europe. In its first tour in the summer of 2022, the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra was performing at Lincoln Center's Damrush Park in a program that included the Abschlusslicher aria from Beethoven's opera Fidelio. As my wife lifted her baton, the great Ukrainian soprano Lyudmila Monastirska sang the recitative and aria that we deliberately programmed as a message to Putin. In English, the words of the recit are, "Monster, what are you plotting? What cruelty do you have in store? The cry of pity, the voice of humanity, can nothing move your savage hearts?" The aria that follows is a message of hope. A rainbow illuminates my path, light my way no matter how long the journey, I do not falter. My step is sure. A voice within me urges me on. My strength lies in faithful love. This summer, the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra will bring its Beethoven Ninth Freedom Tour to the Gdansk shipyards in Poland, where the Solidarity movement was founded, to St. Paul's Cathedral in London, to St. Eustache Church in Paris, to St. John the Divine in New York, to the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. In Carrie Lynn's version of the Ninths, Schiller's Ode to Joy is sung in Ukrainian, and joy is changed to glory, slava, in Ukrainian. Rather than stamping out Ukrainian culture, Putin's infamous invasion is fanning the flames for Ukrainian freedom. As President Zelensky said, music can be a powerful weapon against invaders. Ukrainian art is the art of being brave in the face of the enemy and winning. A few months ago, the Met announced its commission of Ukrainian composer Maxim Kolomits to write an opera about the brave Ukrainian mothers who, against all odds, went behind enemy lines to save their children who had been kidnapped by Putin and his henchwoman, Maria Lvovas-Belova, who along with Putin has been accused of war crimes. We plan to present the opera in Warsaw in the fall of 2026 and at the Metropolitan Opera House in the fall of 2027. In 1964, when President Eisenhower ceremonially broke the ground for the construction of Lincoln Center, created to be America's Acropolis, he said, "This great cultural adventure will not be limited to our borders, and that the attainment of peace with justice is the noblest and most shining ideal towards which man can strive and climb." In today's divisive world, where Russia wants to destroy Ukraine, where China is advancing its plan to annex Taiwan, where a portion of our own Supreme Court has become a religious cult reminiscent of the Spanish Inquisition, now is the time for strong and consistent expressions of moral clarity from leaders who believe in a democratic world, and that includes those of us who play leading roles in the artistic sector. In our documentary film, about Rostropovich. Shostakovich told Rostropovich that in the fight for artistic freedom, to think of himself as a soldier of music. My wife and the members of the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra are today's soldiers of music, and that's the credo I aspire to as well. Thank you very much.
Congratulations, Peter. I'd like to invite Sana Sabag, who is a board member of Carnegie Hall and of the Foreign Policy Association, to present the FPA medal to Clive Gillinson. Sana?
Hello again. Sir Clive Gillinson became the executive and artistic director of Carnegie Hall in July 2005. Under his dynamic leadership, Under his dynamic leadership, Carnegie Hall has been thriving. Since his arrival in New York from London, Clive has worked tirelessly to uphold and maintain the excellence, creativity, diversity, and extraordinary history for which Carnegie Hall is known worldwide. Under his leadership, Carnegie Hall has embarked upon many bold initiatives in its concert and educational programming, including the creation of the large-scale multicultural citywide festivals. Partnering with many of the greatest cultural institutions in New York City, the festivals use the full range of the hall's artistic and educational resources to take audiences on journeys of discovery that extend beyond single performances and concert series to encompass theater, literature, dance, visual arts, talks, opera, and film. As a demonstration of his strong commitment to the belief that the arts should be central to society and accessible to all, Clive conceived and helped implement Ensemble Connect, a program at Carnegie Hall, the Juilliard School, and the Wild Music Institute, in partnership with the New York City Department of Education. This fellowship program provides the finest US-based postgraduate musicians with top-quality performance opportunities, advanced musical training, and intensive teaching instruction and hands-on experience working in New York City public schools. Clive also launched the National Youth Orchestra of the United States of America, bringing together the finest young musicians ages 16 to 19 from across the country. The NYO has gone on both national and international tours. The first NYO USA tour in the summer of 2013 began at the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts and continued on to St. Petersburg and Moscow and concluded with a televised concert at BBC Proms in London. Since then, the orchestra has toured across Europe, Latin America, and Asia. In 2018, NYO Jazz was launched with the aim of bringing together the finest young jazz musicians in the United States. This orchestra tours the world every summer as youth ambassadors. For all these achievements and more, the Foreign Policy Association takes great pride in presenting the Foreign Policy Association Medal to Sir Clive Gillinson. May I? Thank you.
Sana, thank you very much. And it's such a great honor to be here with all of you at the Foreign Policy Association and to be honored by you along with these other three remarkable leaders in New York's cultural life. It means a lot to all of us. It's very hard to believe that it's only 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and where Francis Fukuyama could write that we had reached the end of history and that democracy was triumphant and dictatorships had been overthrown and defeated by democracy. And yet now, in our current festival at Carnegie Hall, which looks at the fall of the Weimar Republic and how Hitler used democracy to destroy democracy, and where we're looking really through that lens at the fragility of democracy, that now, 30 years later, we're looking at a world where, in fact, it's democracy that's under threat, and dictatorships that unfortunately, and dictators that unfortunately seem to hold sway, and where even a lot of non-aligned countries are now tempted away from what we always used to think of as the way the world needed to be run, to be fair, to be right, with the rule of law. And I was just looking, I haven't had a chance to read the piece yet, but I just thought it was symbolic of all of this, that the headline in today's Economist was, "The liberal international order is slowly coming apart." And I mean, I think for all of us, that is a terrifying headline to actually see 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the supposed end of dictatorship. Therefore, I think it's ever more important for all of us who run artistic institutions to use the power of our institutions to try and change the world for the better around us and to address the key issues of the day. Sana mentioned the festivals we've done. We've looked at a lot of countries. We've looked at a lot of issues. We looked at the 60s and the Race Relations Act and the way Lyndon Johnson changed the world in America at that time. We've looked at Afrofuturism. We've got a Latin festival coming up now. So we look at all sorts of aspects of society, but we've also looked at artists under oppression and how artists under most horrific circumstances still created music that was inspirational. It wasn't about the misery. It was about the inspiration, the hope, and the aspiration. And in fact, Peter mentioned Rostropovich's trip to Russia when he went back after his exile. And when I went as his guest, in fact, I was there then. And for me, one of the most moving things, he'd been written out of every single history book in Russia. His recordings had been destroyed where possible. They tried to eliminate him as a person who never existed. Yet one of the greatest artists of all time. And when he went back, one of the things that happened, he went for a visit to the Moscow State Circus. And he was late because he was visiting the graves of Shostakovich and Prokofiev. But he came in late, and then the circus master stopped the circus in order to welcome him and introduce him. And the place exploded for somebody who wasn't meant to exist. So it makes you realize the power of art and the power of communication, that everybody had remembered him. And then he introduced me there to somebody who had looked after, he'd been responsible for the archives of a radio station. And he'd relabeled, at risk to his own life, he'd relabeled all of Rostropovich's recordings as some boring thing of some sort, so nobody would look at them. But he'd actually managed to preserve them all. And the man who, he introduced me as well to the man who'd looked after his home. And there was no likelihood that he would ever go back to Russia. But this man used to go back there every month to clean the home, to look after it in case he ever came back. And the thing Rostropovich said at the time is, don't ever look at the leaders. If you want to know and understand Russia and the Russians, these are the people you look at. These are the people that represent Russia, not the leaders who can be such monsters. Now, Peter and I started almost at the same time. I started at Carnegie Hall about 19 years ago. And one of the first lessons I learned, which, was actually very moving, very nice, And that was how Carnegie Hall matters all around the world. Because when it was announced, I had phone calls from journalists in a lot of places. And one journalist, the phone went and he said, "Hi, I'm from the Bangalore Times. And I want to do an article because I was born in Bangalore. I want to do an article on Bangalore boy takes over Carnegie Hall." Um, and I said, "Well, look, to be honest, I only spent the first 3 months of my life in Bangalore." And he said, "We don't care. We'll take credit for anything." But it was wonderful that it actually mattered in Bangalore who was taking over Carnegie Hall. I mean, one just little story in terms of travels that I just wanted to say, but it also demonstrates, how music can have an impact on people. When I was managing the London Symphony Orchestra, we were involved in a festival that was created in Daytona Beach, and the last place in the world you would expect music. And the guy who ran the local newspaper had created this music festival, and we would go there every year. And we were warned when we went there. There's a bar called Froggy's, for those of you who visit will know that, I'm sure. And what you get warned when you go there is do not ever go to Froggy's. All the bikers go there. I mean, it's terrifying. Everybody's scared to death. So, of course, all our musicians went there every night. And in point of fact, we were just coming to the end of a trip there, and our principal flute player was coming out of Froggy's and about to head home, and he was stopped by 4 huge bikers with tattoos all over their arm and everything. And he said, "Look, please don't hit me. Take anything you want. You can have my watch. You can have my money. You can have anything you like." They said, "No, please, just relax, calm down. All we wanted was your bow tie, just as a memorial of the London Symphony Orchestra visiting Daytona Beach." And so, there were these bikers that actually mattered. That the London Symphony Orchestra was visiting Daytona. Another story, I only just wanted to mention, which was, again, when I was running the London Symphony Orchestra in the early days, one of the things I felt I wanted to do, which is now about 35 years ago, was create a music education program. None of us knew what that was because nobody did them with orchestras at that time. So I spoke to the players and I said, has anybody got any ideas of what they'd want to do in music education? And one of the trombone player said, "I'd like to start a brass band in a prison." So we found a prison in the end, took him down. He spoke to the governor, and the governor introduced him. And the first words out of his mouth were, "Look, you guys, it's very difficult to play brass instruments. So I hope you're going to be here for a very long time." Now, perhaps not the most sensitive. I'm not trying to say anything against trombone players, but the fact is he created a brass band. It was really good. And then the first concert created British prison history, which was one of the prisoners from the brass band was released just before the concert. And because he didn't want to miss the concert, it was the first time in British prison history somebody had gone back to prison voluntarily because he didn't want to miss the concert. So, it's just interesting, how lives can be transformed. At Carnegie Hall, we now do a program coming out of that, really. For the last 12 years, we've been working in Sing Sing prison. We do a huge amount of education work there. And none of the prisoners have ever gone back. When you think of recidivism in America, how many people go back? We work with these prisoners, both teaching them to learn instruments, but also to write music. And literally, nobody's been back, except one prisoner went back for a few weeks, not voluntarily, I'm afraid, but for nothing serious. But the point is, it has transformed their lives. And music and the arts can do that. It has actually given them hope, sense of identity, sense of worth, and the fact that they can do something with their lives. Now, Peter will hate me saying this, but the reason I wanted to come to Carnegie Hall was because I actually think it's the greatest music institution in the world. And I feel quite safe saying that because he spoke before me. So, but the point about that is not anything to do with the glory of Carnegie Hall. And the reason why I felt I had to come, because I was offered a lot of other jobs, but the only reason I said yes to this is because it's the greatest music institution in the world, it means it has the power to change lives in a way no other music institution can, I think. And that really is one of the most important things for all of us who work in the arts, that we use our institution to genuinely try and change the world around us. We do huge education programs now. We work with 800,000 people a year directly, plus millions more online. We try and give everything away free. We've created, as Sala said, we've created the National Youth Orchestra of America. And again, this was something, as a kid, I joined the National Youth Orchestra and we traveled around the world. And as youth ambassadors, I couldn't believe when I came here, there was no National Youth Orchestra. So we created that. Of course, we created NYO, National Youth Orchestra Jazz, because that is America's art form. And we travel the world with that. So this coming summer, the National Youth Orchestra will travel to South America, National Youth Jazz to South Africa. Next year, National Youth Orchestra East Asia. And so, they travel all the world, connecting with young people and creating relationships around the world, which are relationships for life. Because these extraordinarily talented people, they do connect. And coming out of this, we've now created what is called the WOW Festival. You used that earlier, Daisy, the word, but which is actually bringing together youth orchestras from all around the world at the beginning of August to Carnegie Hall. So we'll have a Pan-African youth orchestra, a Chinese youth orchestra, Venezuelan, European Community Youth Orchestra, and of course our own 3 national youth ensembles. Plus, we're bringing over musicians from Ukraine. We're bringing Jewish and Arab musicians from Israel. So we're all the time trying to think, with everything we do, how can you do things that also affect situations around the world that really matter? And part of what we've done, like Peter, we've done a huge amount around Ukraine. We've done fundraising concerts for Ukraine. We've got another one coming up in October. So, again, everybody involved with Carnegie Hall feels we have to engage with the things that matter in the world we live in today. We've also created, in order, again, to create connections between nations, every year at Carnegie Hall, we now do small-scale festivals, firstly around the countries that are crucial to America in the 21st century, like China, like Japan, Korea, countries in Africa. South Africa is a central part of this, Brazil, of course, European countries. So we're looking at making connections all the time with those countries. We're also paying tribute. There are tiny countries where, maybe 10 million people, but they're cultural superpowers. And so this fall, we'll be paying tribute to the Czech Republic, which is just over 10 million people. And yet it's a superpower when it comes to culture. So we're doing that. We do a lot of work in Israel with what's called the Galilee Orchestra, and we've been supporting them and helping. And that is an organization that is all about bringing Jews and Arabs together and them all working together as one. And we've brought them to Carnegie Hall, and we support them and try and help in every way. And we're now working to develop a festival in Israel that will be about the objectives of bringing people together and using music in that way. We've created something called the Lullaby Project, where we work with young mothers. Some of them are incarcerated, most of them are single mothers, a lot of them in terrible circumstances, where our musicians will work with each young mother to help them create a lullaby which they can sing to their baby. And in fact, it's been so successful that Universal Music, the biggest recording company in the world, decided to record some of those lullabies using superstar singers. And then the revenue coming back went to the young mothers who had actually composed the pieces. So it's taken off and it's gone around the world now. Organizations all around the world are beginning to do the Lullaby Project everywhere. There's also, it's wonderful to see Ambassador Suazo here tonight from UNITAR. We're working very closely with Ambassador Suazo on a whole series of concerts, really, again, using music to bring nations together and young people together. So, he's been a fantastic partner. And this is something long-term where Carnegie Hall will be working with the United Nations on that. And then we've created as well, about 6 or 7 years ago, we started Carnegie Hall Plus, which is our video-on-demand channel, which not only brings together performances from Carnegie Hall, it brings together some of the greatest operas from the greatest opera houses in the world, plus the greatest performers, dance, as well as classical music. And this is going around the world now. I mean, it's available everywhere in America. It's going around the world, and we're beginning to work now with other countries, like in the Middle East, about developing channels that are in partnership with them. And, which will also involve bringing Arab musicians here as well as US musicians there, and really trying to use Carnegie Hall Plus, the video on demand channel, as a part of how we develop relationships between nations. So in every way, we're looking at how do we use the power of this extraordinary institution to take music around the world and bring people together and help people to connect, particularly in a world where people are getting more and more polarized, and where it's only things like music and culture that can actually break down those barriers, and where people tend to think of each other as adversaries, as opposed to people who can actually have a conversation. So the last thing I wanted to end with was to say one of the most important people in my life was the great Leonard Bernstein. And I did a huge number of things with Lenny. And one of the things we did was set up with him. This was when I was at the London Symphony Orchestra in 1990. We set up the Pacific Music Festival. Now, this was originally meant to be in Beijing, and Tiananmen Square happened. And so all of us, including the sponsor, Nomura, everybody involved, felt there was no way one could do an idealistic project anymore in China at that time. And Peter talked all about the world that was China then. And I always remember, I mean, again, virtually no cars, thousands of bicycles everywhere you looked, and everybody traveling that way. And almost no skyscrapers, total transformation now. But what then ended up, we all agreed to take it to Sapporo in Japan. And what was interesting, I mean, again, it's seeing the power of the arts. Sapporo had no concert hall. There wasn't much orchestra music. There was almost no great music in Sapporo at that time. Because we brought the Pacific Music Festival there, and it still exists to this day, which is 34 years later, they've now got one of the greatest concert halls in the world. In there, they've got a terrific orchestra. They've just built an opera house. So all of this was a catalyst for utterly transforming Sapporo and the future of Sapporo for all the people there. So I think, one could tell 1,000 stories, but the important thing is wherever you use music and the arts in a really constructive, creative way, you can transform lives, you can transform countries, you can transform societies. And that, I think, is what we believe in at Carnegie Hall. And I think, why we feel this honor is such a special one for all of us at Carnegie Hall. And thank you so much. And Sana, thank you, and Noel as well. Thank you very much.
Congratulations, Clive. I'd like to invite Shelley London, a board member of ABT, to present the FPA medal to Susan Jaffe.
Good evening, everyone. The story of Susan Jaffe's ballet debut is like a fairy tale. Just 18 years old, Susan was getting ready for her very first performance as a member of the Corps de Ballet of the American Ballet Theater. It was Tuesday, December 11th, 1980, about 2 p.m. in the afternoon. The female star of the big pas de deux hadn't shown up for rehearsal. As Susan was walking down the hall of the Kennedy Center, she got word that Mikhail Baryshnikov wanted her to go on instead. At first, she just thought she'd do the rehearsal, but she soon learned that she'd be dancing on opening night with famed dancer Alexander Godunov. The next night, with barely any rehearsal, Susan burst onto the stage in a long arabesque befitting the star she was about to become. The New York Times called her performance a sensational debut, saying that her energy was exciting and she appeared fearless. That night, she received 2 bouquets and 3 curtain calls. But that was just the beginning of Susan's storied career. She danced with ABT for 22 years as a principal dancer
and the New York Times recognized her as the American Ballet Theater's quintessential ballerina. She became a cultural ambassador as well, serving as an international guest artist with the world's leading dance companies. After her career as a dancer, Susan reinvented herself as a choreographer, a teacher, speaker, writer, and leader. She appeared on television and in the movies. She was appointed as the Dean of Dance at the University of North Carolina's School of the Arts. After gaining much acclaim for her accomplishments there, she joined the Pittsburgh Ballet Theater as artistic director. As in her dancing, Susan took risks and expanded her repertoire in her new career, learning strategic planning and finance and marketing and fundraising and leadership. And as has been written about her in the press, she put work into racial justice and equity in an art form that needed it. Now we're so happy that Susan has returned home to ABT as artistic director, interim executive director, and chief cultural ambassador. With every step she's taken on or off the stage, Susan has gained recognition for her intelligence, her excellence, her work ethic, and her grace under pressure, Hemingway's definition of courage. In short, Susan is a model of diplomacy, and that's why I'm so pleased and honored to present the FPA Medal to Susan Jaffe.
What an honor it is to be here with all of you tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about art. We live in really thrilling times, and we also live in very challenging times. The new technologies of today have given us access to information very quickly, and it makes our lives much easier. We have cell phones, computers, social media, Google, etc. These technologies are helpful, but they also interrupt us on a constant basis. In 2005, research carried out by Dr. Glenn Wilson at London's Institute of Psychiatry found that persistent interruptions at work had a profound effect. Those distracted by the new technologies saw a 10-point fall in their IQ. That's twice more than they found in the effects of smoking marijuana. I know, scary, right? By being interrupted on a constant basis, we have a tendency to make more errors, and we become exhausted and overwhelmed. And this also makes us more likely to become disconnected from ourselves. And when we're disconnected, it feels like this. We have a sense of emptiness inside. We feel out of touch with others, and we feel a lack of meaning and purpose in our lives. This is where the arts comes in. Exposure to the arts, whether it's music or fine arts or dance, stirs up our creativity and connects us to our thinking heart, which brings more purpose and meaning into our lives. The value of art lies in its ability to evoke emotion. In our culture, we have often been encouraged to suppress our feelings. Many of us have been taught to pretend we are always happy, even if we don't feel that way inside. Watching live dance or theater or music encourages us to experience in a safe space, meaning in a darkened theater, a full range of emotions, from joy to sorrow and everything in between. As viewing art helps to connect us to our emotions, it also allows us to gain a better understanding of how other people are feeling. For example, if you're sitting in an audience and you see an actor or even a musician or a dancer,
You feel like you know them, even though you've never met them before. When we interact with art, it can create a sense of community. Research led by UCL Division of Psychological and Language Sciences has found that watching live theater can synchronize the heartbeat of all the people in the audience, regardless of whether you know the people in the audience or not. So our hearts sync when we're sitting in an audience. Attending live theater allows you to forget about your daily stresses and helps you to be inspired while you are watching. Those magical and euphoric moments can last with you for days and sometimes weeks afterwards. When art is particularly powerful is when it reflects our personal experiences and our values. When art speaks to our values, we feel a strong emotional connection with it, which enables us to recognize ourselves in the work and appreciate its beauty and meaning. There is a semi-new emerging scientific field called neuroaesthetics, which is the study of how exposure to the arts and exposure to beauty can actually measurably change our brain and body and emotions. Susan Magsamen, founder and director of the International Arts and Mind Lab Center for Applied Neuroaesthetics at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, says that researchers are finding that humans are hardwired for aesthetic experiences. The arts are not just fundamental aspects of our humanity, but also essential to our well-being. That research has proven that exposure to the arts make us feel better. And as a result, for example, some doctors are actually prescribing 20 minutes of exposure to the arts for their patients because it is a very powerful tool for healing. Magsamen also found that art can create new neural pathways in the brain because this happens through sensorial experience. With high visual stimulation, if we see a lot of art, we make a lot of art, we are actually growing parts of our brain dramatically. The more we spend time viewing art, whether it's performing arts or visual arts, the more we stimulate the unconscious and conscious brain functions. And by doing that, they found that we can increase our analytical and problem-solving skills in everyday life. Therefore, and validated by scientific evidence, exposure to the arts can become as essential as, for example, getting our 10,000 steps in a day. The Americans for the Arts research found that 72% of Americans believe that the arts unifies our communities, regardless of age, race, and ethnicity. And 73% agree that it helps them understand other cultures better. They also found that 81% of the population feels that the arts are a positive experience in a troubled world. This is where cultural diplomacy comes in, and where it is particularly powerful. What I love about the arts is that it shows us, all of us in the world, that regardless of race or ethnicity or culture, that we are all essentially the same. We feel the same emotions, from joy to sadness to fear to love. And whether we know it or not, those similarities connect us in deep and profound ways. Cultural diplomacy helps to weave a meaningful connection between countries. It goes beyond the sharing of our art forms and opens up heartfelt connections where all participants can learn and thrive. Cultural diplomacy relies on the power of attraction and the appeal to others' nations, cultures, political ideals, and policies. In a world swamped with ever-shifting dynamics and challenges, there is no more better a time to find a way to create the bridges between our nations. When we journey across the borders with cultural diplomacy in mind, it is a journey of the soul. This past November, American Ballet Theater went to China to perform in Shanghai and Beijing.
And a month before we departed, I was interviewed by quite a few Chinese publications. And all of those journalists wanted to know, was I afraid to bring the company to China because of our leaders having such disagreements? And my message to them was this: ballet is a universal language, and it is for all people everywhere in the world. When we arrived in China, we had a lot of press conferences, and I shared that same message. The heartfelt exchange between our company and the people of China was real and joyful and authentic. That exchange reminded me of our shared values as humans. When we make room for our hearts and souls to connect, there is no better reminder that there are far more commonalities in all of us in the world than there are differences. Perhaps with artistic-driven visits like this, we can keep the peace with countries such as China, as we have in the past. The more we can inspire and bring forth our shared experiences as humans living on this amazing earth, the more we can possibly facilitate healing and enlightenment between our nations. In China, I felt honored to represent the United States and have a chance to share our one true global language, which is art. I thank the Foreign Policy Association for all the important work that you are doing, and I hope that artists in the U.S. can be helpful to you as you forge a peaceful way forward to a healthier, safer, and more harmonious world. Thank you for everything you do. And thank you for this beautiful medal. It is a true honor to be here with all of you tonight, and I accept this formidable medal humbly and with gratitude. Thank you.
Congratulations, Susan. I'd like to invite Tai Heng Cheng, a board member of the Frick Collection and the Foreign Policy Association, to present the FPA medal to Ian Wardropper. Tai?
Good evening. Let me start by offering my congratulations to the other honorees. Peter, you should know I went to watch El Nino last night. It was fabulous. Sir Clive, you might like to know that a director of HSBC Bank told me recently she goes to Carnegie Hall without fail every week. And for a busy corporate director, that's quite an achievement. So I thought you might like to know that. And Susan, I look forward to the ABT Gala next week. It should be fabulous. But I'm here today to talk about Ian Wardropper. Given my dual roles at the Frick and the Foreign Policy Association, I have the distinct honor and pleasure of presenting the Foreign Policy Association Medal to Ian Wardropper, the Frick's Anna Maria and Stephen Cullen Director. The Foreign Policy Association Medal is reserved for those rare, exceptional leaders who, in the judgment of the association, have made significant contributions to cultural diplomacy. Yet, there are some elder statesmen who rue lifetime achievement awards because they portend a departure from high office before the recipient is ready to ride off in glory. Like the wisest of leaders, however, Ian has already announced he will retire from the Frick in 2025 after 14 years of service. So high are Ian's achievements at the Frick that there are simply no peaks left to climb. We cannot, in good conscience, impose further on Ian's time and time with his wife Sarah any longer than we already have. During his tenure, Ian has managed to hold together in harmony at the Frick both radical transformation an unwavering fidelity to heritage and legacy. Ian's responsible for the first and only comprehensive restoration of the Frick Mansion in a century. This was an inherently contradictory task. It involved tearing down some walls and building some new ones, while preserving, at the very same time, the mansion mostly as it has remained for a century. Somehow, Ian pulled it off. Ian has overseen numerous well-reviewed physical exhibitions involving the Frick's core collection of old masters, while at the same time leading the way into the digital age. During the pandemic, the Frick launched its weekly online program, Cocktails with a Curator, which has been viewed 1.7 million times worldwide. At a time when all of humanity was isolated from each other, Ian and his team found a way to offer audiences globally a way to remain connected to art, culture, and each other. This program was the envy of an example for several other august museums. I know this because their board members told me. Ian's visionary leadership has also increased diversity at the Frick. I am living proof of that, while bolstering our cherished civility to each other. At the Frick's first Pride reception in 2022, Mr. Frick's granddaughter, Helen Clay Chase, her daughters and grandchildren attended alongside LGBT supporters of the Frick, both old and new. It is no mean feat to broaden the Frick's community while still retaining its sense of community. All of these achievements are on their face contributions to culture. But what of Ian's contribution to diplomacy, the other half of the criteria for this medal? Like the most influential and adroit diplomats, Ian has gently steered the Frick to achieve his vision without seeming to do much at all, and certainly without imposing on others more than they would want. However, while Ian prefers to shine a light on the Frick rather than himself, I can tell you that he has poured his soul into his work, quietly and consistently over the years, without fuss or fanfare. One of the many puzzles of the restoration was the following challenge. How can a museum remain a museum without public access to its art? Ian's solution was the pinnacle of elegance and a case study in cultural diplomacy. If the public around the world could not come to the Frick to see its art, then the Frick would send its art to the public around the world. And so off our Vermeers went to the Netherlands, our Grecos to Spain, and even a Rembrandts to Poland. This in turn made space at the Frick Brauer, its temporary residence, to exhibit contemporary art in conversation with the Frick's old masters, both shedding new light on our collection and revealing insights about the world today. Let me end by putting into the public record a signal achievement of Ian's cultural diplomacy that would otherwise be consigned to his private collection of contributions to society, which he so discreetly keeps to himself. Earlier this year, the International Court of Justice held hearings on the situation in Gaza, receiving submissions from over 50 states, more than any other case in the court's history. There were protests outside the Peace Palace every day, and reporters seemingly at every turn. The importance to world order of the Gaza case and the other ongoing cases at The Hague cannot be overstated. During this most crucial time in global affairs, Ian arranged for Mauritshuis, the home of Vermeer's Girl with the Pearl Earring, to remain open one evening for the judges to enjoy the museum's paintings and fellowship with each other. I saw, by the end of that evening, a pep in the step of several judges who just hours ago in court wore the weight of decision on their faces. But don't take my word for it. Rather, let me share with Ian and all of you a message sent to me today by Rosemary Barquette, judge of the Iran-US Claims Tribunal former U.S. judge for the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, and before that, Chief Judge of the Florida Supreme Court. She wrote today, "Congratulations on receiving the Foreign Policy Medal. I understand you played a key role in the opening up of Maurits House one evening recently for the judges of the various international courts of The Hague. I and other guests appreciated the special occasion and the opportunity to engage with one another in a beautiful context of the Maurits House art collection. Your accomplishment that evening so amply proves that art institutions and the cultural diplomacy they engage in can play an important role in international affairs. Ian, thank you for making the world better for all of us in your quiet way." No, I should have mentioned to you, one reason why I accepted this assignment is because I want to hang a ribbon on Ian's like a Medal of Freedom.
I thank Ty for his two generous remarks. He is an exemplary trustee, and I don't know how he manages it because he's constantly traveling internationally. I sometimes think that he is the Frick's foreign policy. I'm grateful to the Foreign Policy Association for this award, which really goes to the institution I represent. Ty's spoken quite a lot about the Frick, so that frees me up to speak a little bit more about art and museums and cultural diplomacy. And as a historical institution, I'm going to begin with a little history. The visual arts have a long history of engagement with diplomacy. In the Renaissance, the Medici often gifted small bronzes by their favorite sculptor Giovanni da Bologna to rulers around Europe. His marble, Samson slaying the Philistine, was selected to curry favor with the Duke of Lerma, the powerful prime minister of Spain. The gift worked too well. Lerma liked it so much he requested a mate to it. John Bologna was unavailable, so Ferdinando de' Medici had to commission another sculptor, Cristoforo Stati, to carve a Samson and a lion in 1607 and ship the 1,000-pound marble to Spain. Lerma gave Samson and the Philistines to England's Charles, Prince of Wales, in 1623 when he was shopping for a wife. And later, when he became King Charles I, he gave it to the Duke of Buckingham. Later, George III in 1763 bought it back and gave it to his favorite, Thomas Worsley, and eventually it ended up in the Victoria and Albert Museum. So if this sounds a little bit like the ugly tie or scarf that you get for a birthday that keeps being re-gifted, there is some truth to it, but it shows you the mileage that a cultural gift can have. I should also just point out that the subject, the triumph over a Philistine, is appropriate for cultural diplomacy in that it represents overcoming someone who is hostile or indifferent to culture. In the 18th century, porcelain became a desirable and, for shipping purposes, lighter diplomatic gift. For centuries, Europeans had tried to figure out how the Chinese made this brilliant ceramic, but it wasn't until 1708 near Dresden that the secret was discovered. The Elector of Saxony oversaw the Meissen manufactory tightly. Porcelain was so highly valued that the Elector, Augustus the Strong, gave a porcelain service to Charles III, when the King of Spain married his granddaughter. So many diplomatic gifts were made during this period that the Bard Graduate Center in New York mounted an exhibition called Fragile Diplomacy, based on these porcelain gifts. Augustus was so porcelain mad that he traded Frederick the Great of Prussia a regiment of 600 soldiers for 151 Chinese porcelains that he coveted. Called the Dragoon vases, they're still now in the Porzellansammlung in Dresden. Decorative arts continued to serve in promoting a regime. In 1917, Lenin gave his blessing that the undecorated plates in the Imperial Porcelain Factory in then Petrograd could be used to emblazon approved imagery and slogans like "Workers of the World Unite" on porcelain to be used in Soviet embassies around the world, demonstrating that culture still thrived
in the new state. Of course, the reverse often happens, not giving but taking, pillaging works of art in war. Napoleon's generals heisted cartloads of art from Italy. When the tables were turned, the Vatican sent the famous sculptor Antonio Canova to negotiate the return of the Apollo Belvedere and other treasures to Rome. The historical examples I've cited are now all in museums, where they play quite a different role from the original intent. Art still functions directly at the state level, of course, but museums are now instrumental in cultural diplomacy. In 1982, I was involved with an exhibition called the Vatican Collections, the Papacy and Art, which included the Apollo Belvedere, which went to New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. For the Vatican, it was very much an effort to build relationships in the United States. At the same time, the event moved the Vatican to professionalize its museums to absorb more tourists, for better or worse, drawing an ever larger audience to see its collections and experience the underlying message of the church. A museum like the Frick Collection engages in cultural diplomacy in ways small and large. We are both a local museum serving the Upper East Side, but at the same time, we have an international reputation and send exhibitions, publications, and educational programs abroad. Our renovation and enhancement project, to be finished by the end of this year, will allow us to continue our mission. On a practical level, we are renewing our infrastructure, skylights, heating and air conditioning, electrical, IT, and security systems, so that we can preserve and protect our collections for the enjoyment of future generations. We are an art museum, first and foremost, which has more than doubled in size of collection since we opened to the public in 1935. I mentioned Meissen earlier. We have been given one of the finest collections in the world, and we will have more room to display this German art form. I believe firmly that art, in addition to offering pleasure, provides insight into other cultures, which can lead to a better understanding between peoples. I began my previous job as chairman of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts at the Metropolitan Museum the week of September 11, 2001. I witnessed the solace art can provide in a time of crisis, but also the missed opportunity of the Met's Islamic galleries closed for renovation, not available to offer a window onto the Middle East at a critical time. The Frick will gain more space to support our exhibition programs. We organize first-rate shows, such as one on the Italian 18th century decorative master Luigi Valadier, which Apollo magazine called the best in the world for 2019. We will now have a much improved space dedicated to exhibitions, along with better conservation facilities to mount them. During our move to Frick Madison, our temporary home during construction, we were able to make exceptional loans to museums in Europe, as Ty mentioned, to the National Gallery in London, the Rijksmuseum, the Prado, the Musée d'Orsay, the Gulbenkian Museum in Lisbon, the Pollipezzoli in Milan, and others. In the future, we will be able to work with colleagues in those museums to mount reciprocal exhibitions in our new facilities in New York. Exchanges of art are an obvious way to foster cultural diplomacy. In the absence of these exchanges, the effects are telling. In 1988, I was a curator for a rare exhibition that traveled from the United States to Moscow. Still, for me, one of the most memorable exhibitions I've ever participated in. It's a great collection of medieval art from the Metropolitan Museum, and the Artists of Chicago. Absolutely fine, fragile material. We didn't trust our Russian colleagues to be able to build display cases to our specifications. So we built them all in New York, filled crates, moved them over to Moscow, to the Pushkin. 4 of us, 2 curators, I was one, a conservator and a designer, put the entire exhibition together. Now, in New York, we would never be allowed to touch a screwdriver. They simply wouldn't trust us to be able to do something like that. But there in Russia, we were working like beavers. The Russians came down to look at us because they couldn't believe we were working so hard. And we had sent the plans of the exhibition months ahead. But the day before we were supposed to open, the redoubtable Madame Antonova, who ran that institution with an iron fist for decades, came down and said, no, this is wrong. We don't do this way in Russia. You have to change it completely. And we couldn't. It was some of the most delicate ivories and materials in the world. It simply wasn't possible. So we refused, worrying about international incident. She yelled at us for 20 minutes. They put up a sign in front of the Pushkin that said that this horrible exhibition is due entirely to the Americans. And of course, lines around the block. It was one of the most popular exhibitions ever in Moscow. This was at a time when, exhibitions from Europe or music or other things were rare. So it was enormously important to the public, and it was very moving for us to see that happen. When the Cold War ended, or seemed to, and international loans resumed for the first time in decades, Russian art, ideas, and personnel enriched exhibitions in the West. When loans of art ceased in 2012, I'm not sure how many people recognize this, I lost 10 critical loans from the Hermitage to an exhibition I organized on Bernini terracottas. The cessation of loans between Russia and the U.S. over the last 12 years has closed a door of cooperation and mutual assistance at a time when these are much needed. Museum educational programs, too, offer insights into other cultures, sometimes in surprising ways. Ty mentioned Cocktails with a Curator. Participants from around the world joined the chat programs around each of the 65 episodes. While we offer an extraordinary, intimate experience of art in a magnificent Gilded Age mansion in New York, through this it became clear to us that in a meaningful way, what we have can be shared digitally. Another example of the possibility of sharing art international by digital means is the photo archive in the Frick Art Research Library. One of the foremost art history libraries in the world. It is joined with 14 other photo archives around the world in a consortium called Pharos to make 25 million images of art and associated text available for free on the internet. And I should also mention that in 2013, the Foreign Policy Association hosted an event at the Frick Art Reference Library celebrating the monuments men and women who helped recuperate art after World War II. During the war, it's one of the only times in our history that the library closed to make its resources available to create hundreds of maps to guide Allied bomber pilots to avoid cultural monuments in Europe. Thanks to opera, orchestral music, dance, and art, the world is a richer and a smaller place. While we cannot take this for granted, these art forms have a history of promoting cultural diplomacy. Let's hope this may long continue. In the spirit of Cocktails with the Curator, I raise a virtual toast to that. Thank you.
Congratulations, Ian. Let's give all of our terrific honorees a hand. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening on what has been, in Susan's words, a journey of the soul. Get home safe.
Yeah.